Hello everyone, I am Fornesus, and here is to another late night. This time I do want to talk about a few things. Wait, why is this thing saying there's no signal? Whatever. But yeah. Want to discuss, well, Houston. This is my hometown. Well, I live in the suburb, but the suburb wouldn't, exist without actual Houston proper, so in that regard. At the same time, I wanted to really look into maybe some of the political dynamics. Not trying to be pretentious here or anything like that. Cause I haven't started my political psychology program yet, but this is basically in the realm of political psychology. But yeah, just wanted to spend a late night doing this and maybe a little bit of my capstone that I have to work on. Had been working on it the entire day. But yeah. I'm trying to figure out how to get my Google Chrome. In here. Yeah, there it is. Huh. Random. Very, very random. Yeah. So yeah. Here in Houston, there is what a lot of people have referred to as an HIV crisis. Now, of course, I do think that we need to recognize that a lot of panic that comes from HIV or STI rates has a lot to do with kind of the path dependency coming from the peak of the HIV pandemic, which here in the US occurred during the 80s and 90s, around the time that, well, I guess I was born around the later part of that era. But, it has created a path dependency just because of the trauma that it caused, but also just the puritan pure puritanism of American society, as we have ended up seeing rise in recent times. So Houston's HIV crisis is really about the overall STI rates and overall HIV new transmission rates in the county as a whole. Harris County holds Houston, at least the majority of Houston's population. So right now, or at least back in 2022, it appears that the situation was that around 627 cases per 100,000 people in Harris County, had occurred. New cases happen around my age range, which is this one. I'm about to turn 32, so I'm not getting out of it anytime soon. Yeah, so the zip codes with highest rates, at least over this period of time, 6 years, happened in downtown Montrose and Kashmir Gardens. So for context, downtown Houston is literally like the interchange of the Houston area. You know what, I'm gonna use up the streets because I don't, or whatever. Yeah. No, I don't. Why does it know that I want to go to the University of the Philippines at some point in my life? But yeah, here is, the Houston area. I live in this portion. Again, very much suburban, almost rural actually. I see cattle every day. Um, yeah. Did anything happen? What am I? I don't know what's happening because my mom's so confused about my setup here. But yeah, here is Houston. This is downtown. This is downtown. This whole area is considered to be the downtown district, central business district of Houston. I used to work right here at the oil and gas company that I worked at. So here is downtown. The zip code with the highest rate of HIV, at least between 2015 to 2021. Here's Montrose, second highest rates. So Montrose is a famous, neighborhood here in the Houston area. It used to be a lot more, condensed. Like the queer and trans communities used to be condensed within this part of town. But, due to rising levels of acceptance, just like the normalization of being queer and trans in the Houston area, not anymore. Not as much, but there are still clear signs, such as the fact that Montrose having the second highest rate out of any zip code in the Houston, in the city of Houston, or at least in the county of Harris County. And then Kashmir Gardens, I know it's in more suburban area of Houston. Yeah, over here. So kind of close by, but unlike Montrose and downtown Houston, these are areas of very high gentrification that has occurred over the past few decades. Kashmir Gardens, not as much. It is a majority black neighborhood in the Houston area. And sorry, I guess highest rates of people who live with HIV, which makes sense when it comes to Montrose and yeah. And then of course, usually when there are a lot of people in the area with the condition, there are normally high rates of transmission that you can associate with it, right? With said region. And so we do see that Montrose has the highest rate of new transmissions in Harris County. Second ward, second highest. So second ward, I believe is around. This is the third ward. This is where I went to school here. Second ward, I believe it's yeah, here. It's close to downtown, but it is a gentrifying neighborhood at this point. But it's still a majority black neighborhood in Houston, and I actually have not heard of this one before. Setagast. I don't know. I don't know what that is. Yeah. So I honestly don't know much about this particular zip code, but I guess we can always use Google, or in my case Bing, since is this a Bing browser? Probably no, it's not, but I think I get points by using it. I've just like never heard of this particular neighborhood because it's not like in the spotlight that often here. But this looks like any other Houston neighborhood. This looks like the one that I grew up in, honestly. Looks like at least at one point in time, it was a majority black neighborhood as well. Though, also it has a rich history of activism, which is definitely a good thing to have. Yep, environmental violations by companies like the one I used to work with. Anyway, yeah, the overall, like in terms of like race and ethnicity, black and multiracial communities, and I'm guessing that multiracial in this instance means like Latinos, etc. Experience the highest rates of new HIV cases, either new or existing. It probably, maybe the distinction doesn't matter that much. And of course, for Texas, because apparently Houston does have the highest rate of new STI rates overall in the state. And so it makes sense that this same exact political dynamic is, also applies to Texas as a whole. Yeah, that's like a bit of the context. Of course, famously, like nationally speaking, it is men who have sex with men. So biological males who identify as men who have sex with men who have the highest rate of new HIV infections in the entire country as a whole. So about 2/3. So somebody like myself would be included even though I'm non-binary. And yeah, the Texas trend seems to mimic, the national trends, with the southern US being, the host of around 49% of new cases. So there's that. But yeah, that's the broader context, like the southern region of the US is the most likely to experience new cases of HIV. Texas being, of course, the southern state, and Houston, of course, being the highest in the state of Texas. Possibly one of the highest in the country in terms of new HIV cases. So how does this play out in terms of like political dynamics? So when it comes to political dynamics, we really need to make sure that we don't just like measure the impact, right? Because what we know is what we know. And it can be very easy to simply, limit our analyses based off of, what's available right in front of us. And so we see that legacy health, which is the main like provider for people both in poverty, but also like, it's one of the major health providers here in the Houston area as a whole. They have confirmed that rates of syphilis, even so, it's not just HIV; it's overall like many different conditions that have increased. But there has also been an uptick, particularly with Black women in Houston, in Harris County, getting STIs at a higher rate than other groups. But note also that in recent times, Black women have been facing the brunt of things like, layoffs, right? Um, More famously, in like very recent times, Black women have been targeted in terms of like federal job cuts, right? Some of the most educated people, literally like Black women, I believe, are one of the most educated groups in the entire country. I just like educational attainment, if I'm not forgetting. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. This is something I've seen like thrown around a lot. Yeah. But even with that context, Black women are still heavily underpaid. And it's not just because of the fact that, Black women tend to dominate in more social science adjacent spaces, more like social service type of fields, but it's also the fact that we heavily underpay people in those fields to begin with. So when somebody in such a field gets laid off, what happens, right? It's easier to fall into poverty. It's easier to, it's harder to make it ends meet. What do people do when they are under duress, like financial duress? Well, let's see. I did not know that it was so high in Ukraine. Actually, yep. So here you can see HIV rates have actually increased in over the past like few decades, in fact, in the Ukraine. In Ukraine. Forgot that saying the Ukraine is like more of a Russian thing than anything. Yeah. Severe economic crisis in the 90s led to this. Right? There's stigma, discrimination, etc. Which drive specifically Russians, because I guess in this map it looks like many. Okay, no, actually no, that is not. But here, like you can see in general in Europe, these are the poorest nations among the most war-torn or poorest nations in Europe in terms of like GDP per capita. Russia, even though it has an outside influence in many billionaires, it is very much impoverished as a whole. Same thing with with Ukraine. Same thing with, of course, with Moldova as well. So we can see even in Europe, right? The trend tends to be that like. Actually, let me not just like pull shit out of my. Now let me actually back this up with like an actual map, right? Let me not just like say something just to say it. So yeah, here we can see. Let's try to compare, right? Highest HIV rates in Europe. So, Norway has the lowest, while there are relatively high rates in other nations. They are okay, maybe not just Norway. San Marino, of course, Slovenia and Croatia. They have the lowest rates Next are like most of Central Europe, as well as the UK and most parts of Scandinavia. And then extreme Western Europe has higher rates than usual, or at least higher rates than like their neighbors in Western Europe. But there's a cap for Western Europe. Then let's see, Estonia has around the same as the extreme Western European states, but Eastern Europe is dominated by high rates of HIV. Now let's see GDP per capita in these regions, right? So of course you can say, right, like these nations, they don't have high they are relatively low income, but they also have relatively low rates of HIV transmissions. And of course, I'm not like a public health specialist or anything like that, but I do find this to be interesting in the political sense. Whereas, the poorest among the poorest are, Russia and in Ukraine, Belarus. And you see that they have very high rates. They have very high rates. One additional factor may be religiosity, right? And I think maybe it might be easier to like look at Europe in terms of like this, just because like most people know something about Europe, like it or not. So if I could, yeah, okay, this is not a map I want to look at. Yeah. Of course, this is like without doing any like proper analysis, because you don't need to like analyze everything. Honestly. I mean, I guess this could provide a little bit of context. You do see, not only does are like the Eastern Orthodox or more Russian influenced regions, poorer on average. But you do also see kind of like this divide, right? It's like there's like the sea of like difference, I guess. Like the more wealthy, I mean, let's remember Poland and Lithuania were literally an empire at some point. Maybe that might also have something to do with that. But these are also former Soviet bloc nations. Although, of course, the Soviet bloc literally went up to here and then Yugoslavia. So it is possible, right, that like state policies, for instance, even though there is that religious context, even though there is that like religious context, right? Like, yeah. I mean, overall, I just like looking at maps. And of course, like the point here is that like there are a lot of like factors that can play out when it comes to really like determining political behavior. there are a lot of like factors that you can explore. You can explore GDP per capita. You can explore, you know, this as a result. You can explore religiosity, etc. Ultimately, there could be many factors in any given case, right? Is at this point, like some of these nations, for instance, are like Russia, Belarus, and Moldova and Ukraine. They are, the poorest nations in Europe, right? And as a result, may have like high, they do have like high rates of um STIs, right? Trying to like remember like the Soviet states, like okay, Estonia, Latvia, and um, Lithuania, yeah. Okay, yeah, there's this context that could possibly play in. So in a lot of the same way, let me like tie this to actual like Houston, right? In a lot of the same way, HIV rates in Houston by. So we can also kind of like look at specific areas of Houston, right? See why they may or may not have high rates of HIV. This might be better because it's bigger. Okay, then income zip code. Of course, again, this is not gonna be like a perfect science by any means, right? It's like I already mentioned before, like a lot of the wealthiest like zip codes are literally a lot of the like wealthiest zip codes are literally like zip codes that have like high STI rates, right? So here is, downtown Houston, here's Montrose. And of course they have the highest rates in the entire county, right? For HIV transmission. So of course, given that these are two neighborhoods with many, well, let's just say queer and trans people, yeah, that just so happens to be, at least part of why transmission occurs in those particular areas of the town of Houston. At the same time, you can see here that there are, like basically entire blocks of neighborhoods that have spread. So part of it also does happen to be the fact that like just location, right? If you live in this area, I mean my old neighborhood's here, so like it's part of like kind of like this shadow area of like HIV transmission, right? So there's like a geographical constraint there as well, that despite the fact that like there's a lot of like income diversity, geographic spread is a thing, because even though Houston is a very car dependent city, people are not willing to just like go into traffic and go to like other parts of town without like any good reason whatsoever. Like that's just not gonna happen for most Houstonians. We don't want to waste our time. We simply don't. So normally like people literally just like go to work, get groceries, and go home. Like that's for the most part what happens. And so it does make sense that like it's more of a geographical boundary, right? In terms of like where HIV um is like more prevalent, right? Yeah. At the same time, you also need to see, for instance, like racial background, Houston, zip codes. Like we do also need to see like where um ethnic and racial like lines are kind of like drawn, right? So again, this is like poverty. Maybe this might be a little more interesting in terms of like determining where like spread is, because you can kind of see here like, yeah, it's like downtown area. Yes. Then yeah. So again, of course, there's a lot of different ways that you can like look at the data. There's just a lot of ways to look at like to interpret the data, and really the important part is like making an educated guess that is actually based in reality, right? Because you can also see here like very low transmission rates in this region, which is heavily white. It is the case that like this region is like heavily white, heavily wealthy. There's just a lot of wealthy folks in this like in this general area. Um, they're like called, I think, the memorial villages. Um, yeah, like in this area. Along I-10, the western portion of I-10 in Houston. Um, yeah. And then you have like a lot of like diversity, literally like in the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was A Leaf. Um, in where there are relatively high rates of HIV and transmission. We also have, majority black neighborhoods, which, some of which also do have relatively high rates of HIV transmission. You have some Hispanic neighborhoods which also see, somewhat high rates of HIV transmission, possibly lower compared to some of the more black majority neighborhoods, at least in the southern region. Like I think Megan the Stallion came from like this area. She came from South Park. I just never know where it is on the map. And then again, majority black neighborhoods, and then higher rates of HIV, Hispanic neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, and higher rates of HIV. So it is very heavily racialized in terms of like where HIV is more prevalent, more common. But that's not, of course, to say that it's not, of course, to say that like, hey, avoid black people or avoid Latinos. Like that's not, it should not be the lesson at all. But rather like we do need to understand how like things like discrimination may negatively impact um the individual choices that people make based off of their group affiliation, right? Even though like Montrose is like a relatively white neighborhood, now it actually used to be a lot more diverse back in the day when I was growing up. And even though like there's not really like an ethnic majority in downtown Houston, um the presence of like many members of the LGBTQ community makes, it kind of gets you to a point where like life just feels, I won't say like meaningless, but it's like, life's too short because we can get hate crimed, right? And so you are not at like the psychological state of always being wanting to be like responsible, right? You may not necessarily take seriously, warnings about HIV spread or transmission because, you're already part of marginalized communities or a marginalized community that's just been put down by, the wealthy folks that live in these like more greener areas, right? Like there's a reason why this is, such a wealthy place, and it does have a lot to do with the fact that like these are heavily white communities. Um these as well. Uh Rice University is right here. So like yeah. Yeah. And in a lot of the same way you can also say like, all the political conflict that's happened in Eastern Europe is part of why, maybe HIV rates are happening, right? High HIV rates are happening because there's a lot more stability with the fact that like most of these are literally NATO countries, right? Like most of these are NATO countries, except for like Serbia, of course, or yeah, like they are mostly NATO countries. They have some political stability, and so that like they it's not that they have gone over necessarily like the um cruelty and like from the Soviet occupation, but rather many of these countries are filled with people who have some hope for the future, at least more hope in the future than like um the peoples of like Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, etc. Um, as well as the Caucasus mountains. Yeah. I mean, really, like the point of me like making kind of like having this stream is to kind of like I don't even know if anyone's even listening or whatnot, right? But like the point here is really to understand political behavior from a more broader perspective, like and understand how that plays out locally, right? Because in Houston, you have the factors of race and sexual orientation, gender identity intersecting and resulting, in not only like a picture of like where wealth is concentrated, right? Because there are many white gay men who have money, but because they are still gay men, they have that sense of life is too short. They might die tomorrow. They might be hate crime tomorrow. So that's still a reality here in the Houston area. It's still a reality in Texas as a whole. It's still a reality, honestly, in the country as a whole, right? And so it's just like, okay, well, that's why you can find these like higher rates of HIV in these general regions. They are either, or at least that may partially explain it, why like the rates are higher in these regions, because they are either majority Black, majority Latino, or have, huge gay communities, huge trans communities, huge queer communities, right? And so of course, like, again, correlation and assumption is not causation, but you do need to have like a fair sense of like why an assumption might make sense, right? So yeah. However, of course, but of course, like, when it comes to race and ethnicity, it's always the factor of like, how, by zip code Houston. So like, let's look at this again, right? There is always like the fact that many, if you are white, you are more likely to be wealthier. If you are Black or Latino in Houston, you're more likely to be wealthier. I mean, to be more likely to face like poverty. Doesn't mean that there aren't like Asians who have poverty, who face poverty. I'm certainly one of them. Not having a job and all. But there's a lot of like path dependencies that come from just like positionality, because of course in the U.S. context, in the very recent U.S. context, like Asian Americans have become sort of a model minority, or at least that's how we were raised to aspire to, right? That's why I worked at an oil and gas company, because my parents aspired for me to be, a model minority. That was their hope and dream for me. I ultimately did not agree with that. And plus a layoff happened, so, between those two things, yeah. Now I'm trying to live my life in a way where I'm focusing on my actual wants and needs. It's hard to find yourself in your 30s, but yeah. Yeah, you can see like these are the wealthier neighborhoods. These are also the wider neighborhoods. Many of these neighborhoods are also less likely to have high HIV transmission rates, right? So you can see like on these maps that like many of these neighborhoods are just wealthier, and so there might be some sense of like safety and respectability that makes HIV transmission not necessarily be something that people that the people weird video just like pops up on YouTube. But yeah, there's that, again, path dependency, right? Like these are wealthier areas all the way here. You see village, yeah, these are the memorial villages, I think. I forgot. But yeah. So also more white majority in neighborhoods, and again, of course, there is also the factor of geography particularly in the Houston context. Because Houston is still a very, very much segregated city, except in pockets such as Alief, which is where I'm from, where I grew up. But even within, right, you can see that there are definitively Latino neighborhoods, definitively Black neighborhoods, there are, definitively Asian neighborhoods. This is, of course, where, as a Filipino American, I spent many of my younger years. Right. So even in like the more diverse parts of Houston, even like you can see that like there's a lot more like intersection, a lot more like cross color pollination, whatever you want to call it, on the map compared to a lot of other parts of Houston where like everything is like more or less like, you know, spread, like not, I don't, I don't know about spread out, but like there's a lot more less like color variation in like one particular concentrated area, right? And you can also see that like the HIV rates are, you know, a lot, you know, they're not necessarily low, but they are lower, right? They're lower because like just many of the inhabitants of these like of this area happen to be people who are, for instance, like Nigerian, Filipino. You know, a lot of like the is like Sugarland, which is right here where I currently live. It's like a majority basically like these two have like Sugarland and A-Leaf have like a lot in common in terms of like their demographics. Like most of the black population in Sugarland is in the city of Sugarland is Nigerian, or maybe not most, but like a lot. In the same way that like a lot of the Asian population is Filipino. You know, most likely if you meet someone who's Filipino in Houston, they live here in Sugarland. I just happen to live in a randomly white portion of Sugarland. It just makes things really complicated for me personally. Yeah, you can see that like, you know, those being like very heavily Catholic religious cultures, you know, it's less likely, or like, you know, compared to their neighbors, to neighboring like portions, for like HIV transmission to reach like super high levels. You know, it is still, you know, relatively high, with the HIV in the US happens to be diagnosis rate of about living with HIV in the US. Let's see. Per 100,000 people. 320. Wow, that's actually pretty high. I did not realize that. Oh wait, no, that's Texas as a whole. Okay. So that also of course provides like a different context, right? Like, yeah. Like again, like A-Leave has around the same area as like these majority white neighborhoods. Right? Like you know, like this neighborhood over here, I think this is like, is this like where, not Rice, but you know, yeah. You know, there's a lot of different ways to interpret like these like colored maps, right? But overall, like if you're not like digging too deep into the details, it's just like, you know, you can pretty much you know, understand, or you know, guesstimate like as to why like these different regions with different demographic majorities with different demographic components may have higher or lower rates of HIV or AIDS present in the population, right? You know, and it is an intersection of not only race and income, but also, you know, the kind of like the consistency of like the queer and trans communities in many of these locations as well. Like I don't think they have like an LGBT per Houston zip code. I highly doubt that. It would be funny if they did have one. It would be funny, but it would also be. I don't think they. Yeah, no, they don't have that. You can only hope. You can only wish. But yeah, you can very clearly see that there are just like a lot of different like factors at play when it comes to HIV transmission. Again, I'm not a public health professional or anything of that sort, but it is very interesting to view a public health issue from a political behavior standpoint, right? The fact that like minority stress, whether like that person or group be minoritized based off of gender and sexual orientation, or whether it happened due to race or ethnicity, but also like other factors like religiosity may also matter, right? Like, but of course, like Africa, for instance, for the most part, has many religious people within the continent, and yet HIV rates are relatively high in the continent and have been for decades. And so none of these factors perfectly like encapsulates any of like the reasoning for why HIV transmission may be so high in different parts of the world or in different parts of Houston. But we can at least, make an educated guess. That's why I wanted to show here, kind of like how you can try to make an educated guess, right? But at the same time, we do need to remember that HIV still access, those resources that are necessary for testing. And, of course, testing is only the first step. Because ultimately the goal is to prevent transmission. But the thing about like testing, right, is that if you know that you have HIV, then you can be placed in a cocktail that eventually could make you something called shoot. I won't say like untransmittable, undetectable, yeah. Undetectable. And if somebody is in medically undetectable status, right? And there have been vaccines in recent years that have come out, or at least like test vaccines that have come out to, basically get someone to that status, in fact. And so when somebody is undetectable, they are not able to transmit HIV. There are caveats, right? Like, if somebody who is undetectable ingest something with echinacea, for instance, I learned that the hard way. It can mess with their medications. It can mess with their that person can fall ill. I accidentally gave like somebody who I was intimate with echinacea tea one time, and they were just like, oh, I felt ill, like with the tea that you gave me. That was like after I guess once they came home. So, I was worried for like years. So like 4 years later,